The morning sun had barely touched the horizon over Washington, D.C., when a folded stack of photographs landed on President John F. Kennedy's desk. He lifted the first image with a trembling hand, and his eyes narrowed as he recognized the unmistakable shapes. Medium-range Soviet nuclear missiles, camouflaged but unmistakable, stationed in the sweltering fields of Cuba. The weight of the discovery pressed on him like a physical force. Around the Oval Office, his advisors murmured, the air thick with unease. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, broke the silence with a measured voice. "Mr. President, these are not just missiles, they are nuclear-capable, and within striking distance of every major city in the continental United States." Kennedy leaned back, gripping the arms of his chair. The enormity of the situation gnawed at him. Every second that passed without action was another second in which the Soviets tightened their grip on the island, another second closer to global catastrophe. His mind raced through possibilities: airstrikes, an invasion, diplomacy, but none seemed free of peril. At the same time, over 500 miles south, the streets of Havana pulsed with activity that seemed ordinary at first glance. Trucks rumbled over cobblestone streets, soldiers patrolled intersections, and radio chatter buzzed through temporary communication posts. But beneath the surface, something extraordinary was unfolding. Soviet engineers moved with purpose, unloading crates and erecting missile launchers, their presence carefully hidden from any prying eyes. Fidel Castro, ever the vigilant leader, watched from the balcony of his office, sensing both opportunity and danger. He knew that if the Americans discovered the missiles, the small island could become the flashpoint for a war that might engulf the planet. In Washington, Kennedy convened his first ExComm meeting, a gathering of the nation's top military and intelligence advisors. The room was alive with urgency, voices overlapping, opinions clashing. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, argued for restraint. "We must avoid immediate confrontation. A diplomatic approach may prevent bloodshed." Across the table, General Maxwell Taylor leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the polished wood. "Diplomacy is for when you have time. We are running out of time. We may need to strike before they are fully operational." Every option was weighed with meticulous calculation, yet none offered certainty. A misstep could trigger nuclear war. Kennedy listened quietly, absorbing every word, aware that the decisions in this room could either save or destroy the world. Meanwhile, in a cramped room aboard a U.S. destroyer stationed in the Atlantic, a young sailor stared out over the rolling waves, scanning the horizon for the shadow of an approaching Soviet vessel. He had enlisted to serve his country, never imagining that one day he would find himself as the first line of defense against nuclear annihilation. His hands trembled slightly, and he forced a deep breath, trying to push back the fear gnawing at his stomach. Each ship in the fleet represented a frail barrier between the United States and a potential apocalypse. Back in Cuba, ordinary citizens remained largely unaware of the peril that surrounded them. Children skipped along sunlit streets, their laughter ringing in stark contrast to the tension behind closed doors. Families whispered anxiously about rumors of foreign weapons, unsure whom to trust. Yet in the shadows of the city, the machinery of war was moving with relentless precision. Soldiers checked weapons, engineers calibrated missile guidance systems, and every day brought the island closer to becoming the epicenter of a nuclear confrontation. As the news reached the American public, reports were vague, filled with speculation rather than certainty. Newspapers hinted at military movements, but the true nature of the crisis remained a tightly guarded secret. Kennedy understood that panic at home could be as dangerous as an attack abroad. Containing the crisis required not only military readiness, but also careful management of public perception. In the Oval Office, Kennedy spent hours pacing. He thought about the millions of families who would never see the morning sun if war erupted, about the streets of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles that could be reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. He imagined the panic of ordinary citizens, men and women caught in a war they had no power to stop. Each scenario weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the razor-thin line separating life from annihilation. Tension also crackled across the Atlantic in Moscow. Nikita Khrushchev sat in the Kremlin, eyes flicking over reports from his generals and Cuban allies. The missiles had been moved quickly, almost in secret, but now the Americans had discovered them. Pressure from his military advisors was immediate. Some demanded retaliation, a show of strength that could reassert Soviet dominance. Khrushchev understood the stakes. Any aggressive move risked a confrontation that might not end with negotiation. Yet hesitation risked appearing weak to the world and his own government. Back in Cuba, Castro convened his closest advisors in a dimly lit office. The room smelled of cigar smoke and diesel fuel from the military convoys outside. "We have placed the Soviet weapons, but the Americans are already aware. They are watching, always watching. We must prepare for their reaction." His words carried both defiance and apprehension. The tiny island nation, long overshadowed by its powerful neighbors, now stood at the heart of a global crisis. Through every perspective, the president in Washington, the Soviet premier in Moscow, the Cuban leader on his balcony, the sailor on the Atlantic waves, the world seemed to hold its breath. Each heartbeat, each decision, each whispered conversation carried the weight of lives not yet born and cities not yet destroyed. The first 3 days of October 1962 were not merely about politics or military strategy, they were about the survival of humanity itself. As night fell on Washington, Kennedy returned to the photos on his desk. He traced a finger over the missiles' outlines, silently counting the ways disaster could strike. The phone at his side remained silent, waiting for the next crucial call. Outside, the city glowed under streetlights, unaware that its fate hung in balance. Somewhere in Havana, a young Cuban child looked up at the sky, imagining fireworks, oblivious that they might be soon shadows of doom. The world had stepped onto the edge, and for 13 days, every decision, every pause, and every move would determine whether humanity teetered over the precipice or pulled back from it. The Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, gray and indifferent, as the American destroyers cut through its choppy waves. Every creaking deckboard, every shout of "all ahead full" carried the tension of a world teetering on the brink. The quarantine of Cuba, the euphemistic term for a blockade, was now in effect. U.S. Navy ships intercepted Soviet vessels, ordering them to halt. Every radio transmission was a razor's edge. One misinterpreted message could ignite a war that no one would survive. On the bridge of a destroyer, the young sailor from earlier gripped the railing, scanning the horizon for smoke plumes, flags, any sign of approaching Soviet ships. Sweat ran down his temple despite the cool ocean breeze. He had trained for emergencies, drills, and theoretical war, but nothing had prepared him for the reality that he might be a tiny cog in a machine capable of obliterating millions in an instant. His radio crackled with commands, distant shouts, and the tense murmurs of the officers. "Signal that ship to stop," a captain barked. Each order felt like a gamble with fate. Back in Washington, the atmosphere in the Oval Office was taut with urgency. Kennedy convened ExComm again. His advisors clustered around a long table, the tension in the room almost tangible. Maps of Cuba and the surrounding waters were spread out, pins marking missile sites, naval positions, and cities within range of nuclear strike. McNamara spoke first, his voice cold and deliberate. "The blockade is holding for now, Mr. President. We've stopped several vessels from approaching, but the Soviets are testing our resolve. Every hour they delay, every hesitation on our part, emboldens them." Robert Kennedy, the president's younger brother, leaned forward, voice low but firm. "We need to consider all options. Airstrikes could destroy the missile sites, but it will also guarantee war. Diplomacy may buy time, but do we have that luxury?" Kennedy listened, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Every suggestion, every argument carried unimaginable stakes. One mistake, one miscalculation, and cities across the U.S. could vanish in mushroom clouds. He felt the heavy responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical weight, pressing him to make decisions with precision, courage, and wisdom. Meanwhile, in Havana, the Cuban streets were alive with a mix of routine and heightened awareness. Soldiers marched in formation, missile crates were unloaded under tight supervision, and Castro moved through the city with an almost imperceptible tension in his gait. Citizens whispered rumors about strange activities, curious yet fearful of speaking openly. Children peeked at soldiers carrying unfamiliar weapons, sensing the anxiety but unable to understand its scale. Across the Atlantic, Nikita Khrushchev faced mirrored chaos in Moscow. Advisors debated fiercely, their words sharp and urgent. Some argued for a show of force, demanding that Soviet ships break the blockade. Others warned that any aggressive act would trigger immediate retaliation from the United States. Khrushchev weighed their words carefully, balancing the pride of the Soviet Union against the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war. Each moment of hesitation was a dangerous gamble, each decision a tightrope walk over the abyss. In secret, the first back-channel communications began. Messages flew between Washington and Moscow, coded and careful, every word scrutinized for hidden meaning. Kennedy received the initial letter from Khrushchev. The Soviets proposed removing the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. On the surface, it seemed like a breakthrough, but XCOM knew better. Hidden traps, misinterpretations, or outright deception could doom the fragile negotiations. Even as the leaders deliberated, ordinary people lived with the invisible weight of impending disaster. In Havana, a mother clasped her child's hand tightly, glancing nervously at the military trucks rumbling down the street. In Washington, office workers whispered rumors about missiles in Cuba, a topic officially unconfirmed, yet impossible to ignore. In small towns across the Midwest, families listened to the radio, sensing that something extraordinary and terrifying was unfolding. On the naval front, tension escalated with each passing day. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, some slowing, some stopping, testing American resolve. Aboard the destroyers, sailors stared at the horizon, radios buzzing, hearts pounding. Every movement of a ship, every signal from the other side was a possible spark for war. Orders came down from Kennedy and McNamara. Hold firm, but avoid provocation. It was a delicate balance. Show strength without tipping into aggression. In the White House, Kennedy felt the heavy burden of leadership acutely. He knew the public could never understand the decisions being made in that room, choices about war and peace, decisions that could destroy millions or save the world from catastrophe. He walked through the Oval Office at night, alone, staring out the window at the quiet city below. The lights seemed deceptively peaceful, belying the storm raging just 90 miles south of Florida. Every thought returned to the same question: how close were they to annihilation? Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev stared at a map of Cuba, tracing the potential range of the missiles with his finger. His generals urged immediate action, warning that American hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Yet he also knew that aggression could mean the end of millions of lives, not just in the U.S., but in the Soviet Union and across the globe. The burden of leadership mirrored that of Kennedy. The fate of nations rested on his shoulders. Amid these high-stakes negotiations, human drama continued to unfold in quiet corners. A Cuban farmer watched soldiers unload crates under the blazing sun, knowing that his life, and the lives of his children, might soon be caught in the crossfire of powers beyond comprehension. A CIA analyst in Langley double-checked photographs, aware that a single misreading could set the world on fire. Every person, from leaders to civilians, was part of a drama that spanned continents, oceans, and ideologies. By the end of the seventh day, the blockade had successfully turned back several Soviet ships. The threat of immediate nuclear war had not dissipated, but the world had taken a tentative step back from the edge. Kennedy and Khrushchev, through careful negotiation, secret letters, and unspoken understanding, began to glimpse a path to resolution. But the tension remained, palpable and suffocating, each side wary of miscalculation, each side aware that the slightest mistake could plunge the globe into devastation. The Atlantic waves, indifferent to human fear, crashed against the hulls of U.S. destroyers. The streets of Havana hummed with anxious energy. The corridors of power in Washington and Moscow were alive with whispered debates and coded communications. Humanity stood at a crossroads, its future balanced on a knife edge. Every heartbeat mattered, Every decision carried consequences that would reverberate for generations.
The morning sun over the Caribbean was deceptively calm. Below, in the azure waters surrounding Cuba, warships maneuvered with precise, silent purpose. The U.S. Navy's blockade held firm, a steel cordon keeping Soviet supply ships at bay. But calm is often the most dangerous illusion, and in these days, it masked the tension that threatened to ignite the most catastrophic conflict in human history. Aboard a destroyer, the young sailor squinted into the distance, binoculars pressed to his eyes. A gray silhouette appeared on the horizon, another Soviet vessel. Heart pounding, he waited for the command that could determine life or death. Every officer aboard was tense, every order a delicate gamble. The slightest mistake could trigger a chain reaction no one could stop. He could feel it in the air. The ocean itself seemed charged, vibrating with anticipation. In Washington, President Kennedy convened ExComm for the umpteenth time. The room was quiet at first, heavy with the kind of tension that only comes from confronting humanity's ultimate peril. Kennedy's gaze fixed on the maps of Cuba, the missile sites marked with colored pins, and the projected blast zones sketched over U.S. cities. His voice, calm but resolute, broke the silence. "We are walking a tightrope," he said. "One wrong step and the world will burn. But hesitation carries its own risks. We must be firm, we must be patient, and above all, we must ensure that we do not become the architects of our own destruction." The general shifted uneasily. Maxwell Taylor leaned forward. "Sir, patience may be an option in theory, but theory doesn't account for Soviet miscalculation. Every hour we wait, they may move closer to launch. Every signal we misread could trigger war." Kennedy nodded but remained silent for a long moment. The weight of the world pressed down upon him. Decisions here were not just political, they were moral, existential. In that room, the fate of millions hung in balance, invisible yet palpable, like the oppressive heat of an approaching storm. And then came the event that nearly shattered that fragile calm. A U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot's last words crackled over the radio, a terse signal of tragedy and danger. The Americans had lost one of their most valuable eyes in the sky, and the military feared that the Soviets might interpret the incident as an act of aggression. Panic flickered across the faces of Kennedy's advisors. Some urged immediate retaliation, demanding that bombers be readied for strikes against missile sites. Others counseled caution, warning that a hasty response could spiral into nuclear war. The room felt smaller, suffocating under the weight of history. Every heartbeat, every breath seemed amplified, as if the very walls of the White House understood the stakes. Half a way away in the Kremlin, Khrushchev faced a mirror of the same tension. His generals pushed for a hardline response, insisting that American actions constituted provocation. Others argued for restraint, reminding the premier that escalation could annihilate both superpowers. Khrushchev paced his office, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on a map of Cuba that seemed to pulse with danger. He understood that each choice carried the weight of millions of lives and the potential extinction of civilization. In Havana, Fidel Castro watched the skies nervously. Soldiers and technicians worked feverishly at missile sites, oblivious to the silent calculations being made thousands of miles away. Families huddled in basements or behind reinforced doors, children clinging to parents in fear. Even ordinary moments, preparing breakfast, tending to livestock, walking the streets, were now shadowed by the possibility of nuclear fire. The island had become a pressure cooker, every second a potential ignition point. As the world teetered, secret diplomacy became the only lifeline. Messages flew between Washington and Moscow, coded and cautious. In the back channels, negotiators debated wording with extreme precision, aware that a single ambiguous sentence could trigger an irrevocable chain of events. Kennedy's team received a follow-up letter from Khrushchev. The Soviets were willing to remove the missiles if the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. It was a lifeline, but fraught with danger. How could either side trust the other not to misinterpret intentions? On the American destroyers, the tension was mirrored in small human moments. Sailors slept fitfully in narrow bunks, dreams haunted by mushroom clouds and the cries of loved ones they might never see again. Officers ate in silence, chewing mechanically, their eyes flicking to radar screens and horizon lines, waiting for signals, for mistakes, for catastrophe. Every movement of a Soviet vessel could be interpreted as aggression. Every hesitation could be fatal. In Moscow, Khrushchev and his advisors debated late into the night. Some proposed immediate escalation, bombing or even nuclear retaliation in response to perceived provocations. Others warned that the Americans would respond with overwhelming force. The conversation was not abstract. It was a negotiation with life and death, a calculus of survival. One wrong move could mean millions dead, cities erased, and a world plunged into fire. Meanwhile, in Cuba, ordinary people navigated their daily routines under extraordinary circumstances. A shopkeeper shuttered his windows as soldiers passed. A young girl clutched her mother's hand. A teacher tried to reassure students about why drills were happening so often. Fear had become a constant companion, invisible but heavy, shaping every interaction. The days dragged on, each moment stretching with unbearable weight. Kennedy paced the Oval Office at night, staring at the faint glow of the city. He imagined the devastation a nuclear strike could wreak. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, everything gone in minutes. He thought of the families, the streets, the lives that would vanish, and the moral burden pressed harder with every hour. Finally, tentative hope flickered on the horizon. Through careful negotiation and settled diplomacy, both superpowers began to glimpse a path away from the precipice. Khrushchev agreed, at least in principle, to consider removing the missiles if the U.S. made its promise not to invade. The Americans began discussions about Jupiter missiles in Turkey, recognizing that concessions might save millions of lives. But even as diplomacy breathed a fragile sigh of relief, the shadow of catastrophe remained. Every sailor on the ships, every soldier in Cuba, every advisor in Washington and Moscow knew that peace was provisional, fragile, and contingent on restraint, trust, and timing. Humanity had stepped to the edge, and every decision in those 4 days would echo for decades. The U-2 plane incident, the tense naval maneuvers, the whispered debates in halls of power, and the silent fear of ordinary civilians all converged into a single, unrelenting pressure. The world had been closer to nuclear war than most could comprehend. Every decision was a step on a knife edge, and for the first time it felt as though the entire human race held its collective breath. As night fell across Washington and Havana, across Moscow and the Atlantic, silence replaced the constant hum of crisis. It was temporary, fragile, and deceptive, like the calm before a storm. But in the minds of those who understood the stakes, there was no rest, only the urgent, gnawing awareness that the world was still on the brink. And for 13 days, humanity would walk this razor's edge, aware that one wrong step, one misread message, one moment of misjudgment could send the globe hurtling into fire.
The world had held its breath for 12 days. In Washington, the tension in the White House was almost tangible, a weight pressing on every shoulder. President John F. Kennedy sat in the cabinet room, staring at the envelope that contained Khrushchev's latest message. He read it slowly, absorbing the words like a man trying to measure a storm cloud. The Soviet premier promised to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly pledged not to invade. Privately, he requested that the U.S. also remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The solution was fragile, delicate, a balance so precarious that even the slightest misstep could undo 13 days of calculated restraint. He spoke quietly to his ex-com, explaining the plan, a public agreement not to invade Cuba, while privately negotiating the withdrawal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. The advisors nodded, tension in their faces slowly easing, though none dared to fully relax. Across the Atlantic, Khrushchev received confirmation that Kennedy had accepted the terms. In the Kremlin, his generals waited anxiously, some skeptical, some relieved. The missiles would be dismantled. The U.S. would not invade. The invisible thread connecting humanity's survival had not broken. Yet the shadow of potential disaster lingered in the minds of all who had watched the delicate dance unfold. In Havana, soldiers and engineers moved quickly, dismantling missile sites with precision. Families who had hidden in basements and shelters emerged cautiously, peeking at streets that no longer thrummed with the quiet menace of armored vehicles and armed troops. Children laughed again, tentative but genuine, as parents whispered reassurances. The city exhaled, but the memory of the last 2 weeks, the fear, the tension, the invisible hand of potential annihilation, remained embedded in every heart. At sea, U.S. destroyers that had patrolled the quarantine line for nearly 2 weeks finally received the order to stand down. Sailors slumped in exhaustion on decks slick with Atlantic spray. Some laughed shakily, others simply stared at the horizon, unable to comprehend the enormity of what had just passed. A young sailor thought of his family back home, of streets and cities spared, of lives that continued because of restraint, calculation, and courage. In the Oval Office, Kennedy reflected on the moral weight of leadership. The choices had not been easy nor free from compromise. The world had teetered on the edge of nuclear war, and history had demanded that the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union act with a combination of bravery, prudence, and humanity. One wrong decision, one misread signal, and the consequences would have been unimaginable. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev considered the lessons of the crisis. He had faced immense pressure from his military advisors to respond aggressively, to assert Soviet power through force. Yet his restraint, tempered by the potential for mutual destruction, had avoided catastrophe. Even as relief swept through the Kremlin, the Soviet leader knew the fragility of peace and the ever-present risk of future confrontation. In Cuba, the people began to reconcile with the normalcy slowly returning to their lives. Markets reopened, soldiers stood down, and schools resumed. But beneath this return to routine lay a quiet awareness of vulnerability, the understanding that the world's largest powers had used their island as a chessboard in a game that could have destroyed them all. Families discussed what-ifs, neighbors exchanged stories of fear and uncertainty, and a generation of children grew up knowing the shadow of nuclear war had hovered over their homes.
the crisis had also left deep marks on the ordinary men and women who had served on the front lines. Sailors aboard ships, soldiers at missile sites, intelligence analysts in dimly lit rooms, all carried the memory of tensions so intense that it became almost physical. They had seen, felt, and sometimes imagined the annihilation that could have come with one misstep. For some, relief came slowly, almost reluctantly, as if their bodies could not release the strain accumulated over 13 days of fear and uncertainty. Yet, beyond the immediate relief, the crisis forced the world to reckon with the implications of nuclear weaponry, diplomacy, and human fallibility. Kennedy addressed the nation briefly, without dramatics, acknowledging the resolution while carefully avoiding the details that might provoke public panic or political tension. The people of the United States, and indeed the world, would never fully comprehend the narrowness of the escape. But for those who understood, the lesson was clear. Diplomacy, restraint, and courage were as essential as military strength. In private, Kennedy and his closest advisors reflected on the human dimension of the crisis. Decisions had been made not just in terms of strategy or geopolitics, but in the knowledge that millions of lives hung in balance. The stakes had been existential, the margins infinitesimal. And yet, for all the fear and uncertainty, humanity had endured. Leaders on both sides had acted with care, with foresight, and with a moral awareness that the destruction of civilization could not be justified, even in the pursuit of political or military objectives. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens resumed their lives, but the events of those 13 days lingered in collective memory. Newspapers, radios, and private conversations hinted at what had occurred, though much remained classified. Families in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles went about their routines, unaware that mushroom clouds had hovered just beyond the horizon. In Havana, parents told their children to return to school, but whispered warnings lingered. The world was larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. The crisis ended not with the flash of war, but with quiet, deliberate action, a testament to diplomacy, negotiation, and the human capacity for reason in moments of extreme peril. Kennedy and Khrushchev had both recognized that aggression could only lead to annihilation, and restraint had prevailed over pride. As night fell on the 13th day, the Atlantic shimmered with calm once again, reflecting the fading lights of ships finally free from the weight of constant vigilance. Havana breathed in a cautious peace, while Washington and Moscow exhaled, aware of the fragile threat that had held the world together. History would remember the crisis not only as a confrontation between superpowers, but as a moment when humanity collectively teetered on the edge of oblivion. Leaders, soldiers, and ordinary citizens alike had been forced to confront mortality, responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked power. And in the end, through diplomacy, courage, and calculated risk, the world had stepped back from the brink. Yet the echoes of those 13 days endured, a reminder that peace is never guaranteed, that power carries immense responsibility, and that the choices of a few can alter the fate of millions. Humanity had survived, but the memory of almost losing everything would linger in the minds of those who had stood at the edge of doom, and in the history books that would chronicle their courage, restraint, and the fragile triumph of reason over chaos.